Happy Monday! Welcome back to Drinking by My Shelf. My name is Emma and today I am recommending a bunch of books for you to read during Women's History Month, even if, much like me, you don't really like history. If you didn't already know, March is Women's History Month, and so for the month of March I really wanted to theme my reading around this, but most of the recommendations that I find when I Google list of books to read in Women's History Month are either historical non-fiction, or you might find a lot of historical fiction, which isn't really my favourite genre. I do have both of those in this list. I've tried to include loads of different genres in here. These are all books that I have really enjoyed. So even if reading like dense historical non-fiction just makes you feel like you're at school again, you don't want to do it, that's fine. I think you will still enjoy these, and I've got the type of historical fiction that I really love in here, as well as books that don't fit into any of those categories and wouldn't be like your first most obvious pick for Women's History Month, but I think they really fit the theme. And this video is being sponsored today by Ana Luisa, one of my favourite brands to work with. I've worked with them 4 times now because I absolutely love them. They are a really sustainable jewellery brand. They produce amazing quality fine jewellery that is designed to last with you your whole life. It's like the antidote to fast fashion, and they're completely carbon neutral. They offset 100% of their carbon emissions all the way from sourcing their materials to disposal. So it's absolutely incredible. You will find pieces ranging from around $39 upwards, so there is something for lots of different budgets in there. But as I said, these are pieces that are designed to last with you your whole life, so they are worth investing in that slightly more expensive jewellery that is so well made. I basically live in Ana Luisa jewellery now, but for this video I just wanted to show you the newest pieces that they have sent me, and then I promise we will get into the books. But first, just admire my jewellery. I am wearing here the Chloe ring. This costs £51, but if you use my code, MyShelf10, I'll put the link in the description below, you can get 10% off anything. So I'm giving you the full prices, but you can get a discount. So this is my Chloe ring. It's like gold braided. I love it. I'm also wearing the Oblivion bracelet set. This is really dainty, gorgeous little bracelets here. They cost £43 together. I have been wearing them in a whole stack with loads of other Ana Luisa bracelets as well, so they stack really well, but they're just so elegant. I love this little pearl detail down here as well. And then I've also got some new earrings, the Cassie hoop earrings, which again were £51 full price. I completely fell in love with these the second I saw them on the website. It's such a unique, elegant little design that hugs right close to your ear like this. So thank you so much to Ana Luisa for sponsoring this video, and they were really enthusiastic about the theme of this video as well, which was really fun. So let's get into it. Here are my recommendations for Women's History Month, even if you hate history. I'm going to start with a couple of graphic novel recommendations. So this is Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. So this is recent history. It's a graphic novel telling of her own story, growing up in Iran against the backdrop of the Iranian Revolution, and then moving as a teenager to Europe and then eventually going back home. It's a really powerful and really engaging story. I was so into it, just like any other fiction book, but then I was learning a lot along the way about this period of modern history that I really didn't know anything about. And you might hear me saying those words several times throughout this video because I really don't know that much about any periods of history. I was not very good at history at school, and even if I was, we basically just learn World War II on repeat. So anything that isn't specifically learning about World War II, I didn't really know it before, but this was a great way to learn a bit about that. I've just seen a quote on the back of this I think is really accurate. The magic of Marjane Satrapi's work is that it can condense a whole country's tragedy into one poignant, funny scene after another. So I think that's why I enjoyed and was so moved by this one, because it didn't read like a textbook. It wasn't explicitly teaching me the history of this country. That was just the backdrop that I absorbed along the way of these really moving, sometimes funny, sometimes heartbreaking scenes. I've also got another of Marjane Satrapi's graphic novels here, Embroideries. So this is about her spending an afternoon with a bunch of the women from her extended family. They're embroidering, they are drinking tea, and they are gossiping. So again, we're learning modern history. It was written in 2003. Okay, so it's set in 2003, but there are so many characters in here, so many generations. So we are learning about the last few generations of women's history in Iran and their different cultures, their different traditions. I really, really enjoyed it. And it's funny. They talk about sex and it's shocking and it's hilarious. For a woman who will go down in history, there is Malala. So this is I Am Malala, her own autobiography. She is an incredible woman and girl at the time that she wrote this and at the time that she experienced a lot of these things. Malala is the girl who was shot by the Taliban on a school bus on her way to school, just fighting for her right to receive an education. She did survive, and she is just an incredible person. She was the youngest ever winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. She is just sticking up for what she believes in and will not be silenced. So that is the kind of woman who will go down in history. Then I've got Here We Are, Feminism for the Real World. This is an essay collection, or it's not all essays, it's some drawings, it's some stories, some little comics. It's a really fun collection put together by Kelly Jensen. So this is very much about feminism in the present day, but we do get the context of the history of feminism leading up to this point. And I think that that's quite an interesting way of thinking about history, is that you can actually understand history by looking at the present. Look at what women are fighting for today, and that's a kind of interesting way to think about women's history. And when we're talking about women and women's history, it's really important that we include trans women's stories and trans women's history in that. So I've got the autobiography here of Janet Mock. This is called Redefining Realness. Again, this is a present day story, but this is Janet Mock's own story of growing up trans and multiracial in America and the many kind of intersecting forms of oppression that she experienced from that. This, I'm pretty certain, was the first book I ever read written by a trans person. I read this about 4 or 5 years ago, and I really liked the way that it forced me to question my own understanding of what gender meant, of what being trans meant. She doesn't fit into that kind of cliche narrative of I always knew I was a woman in a man's body. Like, that's not how she felt, and she's not afraid to say that's not true, that wasn't my experience. It might be for some people that wasn't my experience. And again, I think if we're thinking about women's history, it's fascinating to read stories like this and then look at women from the past and consider whether they might have been having these same kind of experiences. Okay, this is a book I've just got and I'm in the process of reading it. It's The Love Letters of Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville-West. So these are their real letters to each other. I am only like a few pages in, but I have read quite a lot of these letters before when I was doing my women's studies course. I'm obsessed. I love these two women, especially Vita Sackville-West. I grew up really near her house, so I always kind of knew her as a figure who had this beautiful garden that we would go visit. I didn't know anything about her love story with Virginia Woolf, her love story with, I've forgotten her name, Violet somebody. You can read all about that in the book Portrait of a Marriage, which was written by Vita Sackville-West's son. And again, that was a really, really moving love story. So I'm just kind of obsessed with her. If you didn't know the connection here, Vita Sackville-West is actually the woman that inspired Virginia Woolf to write Orlando. She is Orlando, and this book has got an introduction by Alison Bechdel. So yeah, like I said, I'm obsessed. I think I've said the word obsessed too many times. But talking of Vita Sackville-West, I have got one of her books here, All Passion Spent, and I'm going to pair this up with the Zora Neale Hurston book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. So these are two fiction novels, but I studied these books together on my women's studies course, and I wrote an essay called something like, shall I actually get the title up? Here it is. Marriage, Labour and Reproduction in Vita Sackville-West's All Passion Spent and Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. So I basically wrote in this essay about how these books explored the way women are positioned as resources within a heteronormative partnership to be used by their husbands. And then it goes on, it's a really long sentence. God, I sound so clever, I don't know what any of these words mean anymore. But basically, I think that these are two really, really interesting novels to read and look at women's position within heteronormative marriage in history. Women have been required to do so much unpaid labour through history, emotional labour, reproductive labour, literally labour, as well as physical labour, all the while being considered the weaker sex. So I found both of these books really, really interesting in that context, and they're also just fantastic novels. I'm actually going to say particularly that Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston is one of the best books ever. It was one of the books that inspired the colour purple, and you can definitely kind of see where that inspiration came from when you read it. It's very sad, but it's wonderful. Okay, a very famous book here, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. So this is a really interesting one because we describe this book as a feminist dystopia written about this scary future. But actually, even Margaret Atwood herself said that every single thing that happens in this book is something that happened to women at some point in history. The dystopia here is essentially just seeing it happen to rich white women. It is not new. Margaret Atwood did not invent any of this terrible treatment of women. So there you go, that's a way to read a dystopian futuristic novel and still have it be about history, because this is women's history written in here, and it's awful. I've got a sci-fi novel in here for the sci-fi fans, Kindred by Octavia Butler. I'm not usually a sci-fi fan, but I absolutely adored this book. It is harrowing though. So this is about, it was written in the 70s, so that's like present day in the novel. So in the present day 70s, a young woman called Dana is just turning 26-ish, and she suddenly is like flashed back to the past where she ends up saving a young white boy from drowning. And this keeps happening. She keeps being pulled back and forwards between present day and the past, watching this little boy grow up and become a slave owner. And she eventually realises the ways in which their lives are connected over a century apart. So it's in 1815 where she first meets him, and then going forward the next few decades from there. And in that time in the past, she is assumed to be a slave. A black woman on her own on a Maryland plantation in the 1800s, she's assumed to be a slave, and so is treated as a slave. And so through this sci-fi novel, we again learn a lot of black history, and specifically in this book, black women's history. It's a really, really good book, this one. Oh, this is a great one. This actually says history on it. The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. This is my proof copy. The real cover will look like this. This is a collection of short stories, and I adored it. I gave this one 5 stars, and I'm not usually a huge short story person. I think this is a fantastic one to read in Women's History Month because it's all about the rewriting of history, who owns history, who decides what history is recorded, and how it can be changed and reimagined and reconsidered through the years. So if you love history, fantastic, and if you've always thought that history was boring, like me, because you thought it was just like a list of dates, this might make you actually interested in thinking more about history and how we learn it. So the stories in here are all really different, but they're all linked by that theme of historical corrections. Up until here in the book is stories, and then this is a novella called The Office of Historical Corrections, and it's just all incredible start to finish. But I think as the book went on, I loved it just even more and more and more. For some very scarily relevant historical fiction, The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue is set 100 years ago during the last Great Flu. So it's set in Ireland on a maternity ward, and these women have been put into quarantine because there is this terrible flu going around. So it's a scary time to read this book, but I did absolutely love it, and it is very much about women's history. So the setting is particularly terrifying. It's set in Ireland during a time when contraception was not readily available to most women, and so women were pregnant so many times, and it talks in quite graphic detail in here about the effect that that has on their bodies. Also talks in quite graphic detail about labour in general. It is not a book that made me want to give birth, I'll tell you that for free. But there were so many amazing quotes in here. I wonder if I bookmarked. There was one I particularly enjoyed that I think I've talked about in the Balancing the Books before when I first wrapped up this book. But there was a section where we have 3 main characters, a nurse, a doctor and a volunteer, all women working in this maternity ward. But our main character is the nurse. And she is arguing with one of the men who works at the hospital because he is saying that he doesn't believe women should have the right to vote. Because they haven't paid the blood tax, I think is how he phrases it, compared to men who have actually fought and died for their country. And she tells him to look around, look at this maternity ward. Women have been paying the blood tax since the beginning of time. Women have been dying for their country since the beginning of time. And there's a really, really interesting perspective there on women's history, and how I'm very glad now that if I do have to give birth, it won't have to be in conditions like women did in the past. This is a fun historical fiction, The Age of Light by Whitney Scharer. If you want something, again, a bit more recent, this is set in the 20s, which is always a fun era to read about. So this is about, what's her name? She's famous. Hang on a minute. Lee Miller. Lee Miller was a photographer, and she arrives in Paris in 1929 to pursue her dream of becoming a photographer, and catches the eye of the artist Man Ray. So this is all true, and she became his muse. But this book really redefines what it means to be a muse and takes her out of that role, showing what an incredible artist she was in her own right, and that being a muse is more than just being a beautiful body that inspires an artist, that she was actually an amazing creator. The description describes it a lot better than I just did. It brings a brilliant and revolutionary artist out of the shadow of a man's legacy and into the light. That's exactly what it does. The Adventures of Maud West, Lady Detective, is one of the only straightforward non-fiction biographies that I have ever loved. It's not really my thing. Like I said, I don't really love history or non-fiction, but I gave this one 5 stars. I just adored it. So this is the story of Maud West, who was a lady detective, and it's so much fun. The author, Susannah Stapleton, becomes a detective herself, trying to figure out the truth of Maud West's life. She was this enigma of a woman. She used to write stories, fictional stories, about what she was up to for the tabloids, so it's now really hard to separate what she was actually doing with these over-the-top ridiculous stories she was inventing. It's got cliffhangers on every page. It's really, really fun. So just a story of one particular woman from history that's definitely fun. And then finishing off with some more pure fiction, but that teaches you a bit of real history. There's Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. This is one that goes through about 10 generations to lead up to present day. It begins with these 2 sisters who are separated at birth. One of them is sold as a slave, and one of them is married off to be a slave trader's wife. And then we just switch between them, between the 2 different families, and watch how differently the lives turn out of the different branches of the family through the generations. So you get a huge sweeping span of history in this one. American history and Ghanaian history, because one branch of the family moves to the US, and another one remains for more generations in Ghana. So you learn a lot. It's fantastic, and I loved the span of it. I loved all the characters that you meet, and I cried a lot. 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes is a really fun one for classics lovers, for fans of mythology. This is a retelling of the myth of the Trojan War from the perspective of all of the different women involved in this story. So you have goddesses, you have nymphs, you have princesses, you have slave girls. So many different voices come together to tell this story. So obviously this is myth, this isn't true history, but I still think it's a really interesting way to learn something about history by learning about the stories of the past, the stories that were deemed important in the past. And some of it may have been true. Who knows? A lot of people do know, I just don't know personally. Finally, the last book I've got here is Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, another of my 5-star reads that also has a huge cast of characters. So this, again, is another one that is mostly set in the present day. It goes between about 12 different characters, mostly women, mostly black, but some of them do go back into the past, a few generations back, and it's kind of a modern history of the experience of being a black woman in Britain. So the furthest back we go in time is to 1905, and then it comes all the way up to present day. And it's described here as a gloriously new kind of history for this old country, ever dynamic, ever expanding, and utterly irresistible. It is fantastic. It's a Booker Prize winner, which can sometimes feel a little inaccessible, but I really, really recommend this one. I was nervous that it would be too literary for me, and I actually found it so accessible and easy to read. So there you go, a bunch of books you can read throughout Women's History Month without having to get out your textbooks. I tried to get most different genres in there, but let me know. There are a ton of genres I missed off, so let me know if there's any particular recommendations you want and I can do my best to think of them. And thank you again to Anna Louisa for sponsoring this video. Once again, I will put the link in my description box below, as well as my code, MyShelf10, where you can get 10% off any purchase, and you can look as glamorous and sparkly as me. I say that, ignore this finger. I cut this finger, it doesn't look very glamorous, so we'll hide that one. But the rest of me looks very glam today, so thanks to Anna Louisa for that. And that's all from me. Happy Women's History Month.